President Trump urged Congress to repeal Section 230 of the National Defense Authorization Act, threatening to veto the $740 billion defense bill if legal protections for social media companies aren't included. So, Senior Director of Policy at the Conservative Partnership Institute, great friend of the show, Rachel Bovard, joins me now to discuss. Rachel, good to see you.
Thanks for having me.
So break this down for us, Rachel. The president says he's going to veto the NDAA, as it's known here in Washington, if it doesn't include a Section 230. It doesn't include a Section 230 repeal. Now, the Senate Armed Services Committee Chairman Jim Inhofe says that's not going to happen. Do you think the president will actually veto it? And what exactly is going on here? What would a repeal even mean?
So I'm skeptical that Trump is actually going to veto over this, but at the same time, it would be the most Trumpian thing that's ever happened to veto, because don't forget, the NDAA is the golden calf of Washington.
That's right.
You know, it's the bill that authorizes every military industrial complex project for the next year. So a lot of people's money and time is tied into this legislation. So heads have been exploding all over Washington over this veto threat. But that said, you know, what Section 230 is, right? It protects these tech giants. It's their legal immunity, and it allows them to remove content without recourse. And it also protects them from getting sued for anything that's posted on the platform by the user. Now, this is an existential threat to their business model. Repealing this changes the way they do business. They would still be First Amendment actors. They'd just be subject to the rules and regulations that everyone else plays by. But again, this is a business threat to these companies, and that's why there's so much light and heat around it.
Mm-hmm. So that's the interesting thing. I mean, this is basically, I'm not entirely sure even what the impetus of this is in terms of the Trump project. I guess the question is repeal outright, what would that actually mean? Because as I understand it, everybody else has been talking about reform. Repealing this straight up, what would that mean for basically for everybody?
Well, repeal would be a dramatic step. Again, you hear a lot of hyperbolic statements that the internet would melt down without Section 230. Those are without merit. I mean, Facebook and Twitter and Google, all of them operate in Europe without a Section 230 protection. They have various other kinds of protections. But essentially, it would just mean that users could sue these platforms. They'd be liable. Now, you'd also have comment sections of smaller platforms that would be, liable, like The Hill. Anything posted in the comments, The Hill would then be liable for. So what you probably see is some kind of patch, right? A repeal and then some kind of limited liability shield. But at the end of the day, these companies would survive. They just have to change the way they do business.
So that's the interesting part, which is that whenever people are talking, I think, about Section 230, what they're talking about is like, I am mad at Facebook for doing X. Why are people upset about this?
Well, I think, they see these companies receiving a giant legal protection and then not having to do anything really to be accountable to it, to be a good actor for receiving it. Because again, these companies take down content all the time. They label it misinformation and they say, well, you can't show this on our platform. And now there are people who say, well, that's just their First Amendment right. But it's a protected First Amendment right in the sense that it's a privileged one. Right? My First Amendment is not as privileged as these companies. And so I think that's what people are upset about, is that these companies are receiving special treatment, the type of treatment that's not available to newspapers, that's not available to movie studios, that's not available to other First Amendment actors, and they're not having to be accountable to it. So it's this feeling of unfairness, I think, that people are responding to.
And how is the general split within the right on this? Because this is probably, I would say, the biggest civil war between like the libertarians and the people who are used and willing to yield government power. Let's be at least fair to them. What's their position, and then what's your position?
So their position is that this is not a subsidy, that this is just a critical protection to allow businesses to grow and to innovate. And why are we targeting private companies? And, my position is simply that this is a subsidy. Any kind of protection that you give to industry is tantamount to a subsidy, particularly one where they reap billions from. But second, I think it gets to this point that this is moderation done at a massive, unprecedented scale. It's not simply, Facebook is not your local newspaper deciding what to run. Facebook is an international conglomerate controlling information for billions of people. And so I do think that, these content moderation practices aren't just merely First Amendment actors. They're acting in a privileged space, and they're actually changing how we interact with each other. They're changing how we gather news and information. So myself, I'm a proponent of Section 230 reform, but if repeal's the place we got to start to get reform, I'm for that too.
Got it. Well, we've got a very good case here made by Rachel Bovard. Thank you, Rachel. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
So, one House Democrat says a vote against Nancy Pelosi is a vote for QAnon. We're going to get into that when Rising continues.